Finding the right person for the job isn't easy. Just ask someone who hired a lounge singer to be their office receptionist.
Hello, this is Mickey Marquis, and you've reached the office of Doug & Associates. Thank you very much. Catch me Tuesday nights at the Hotel Johnson. Hello?
But if you've got an insurance question, you can always count on your local Geico agent. They can bundle your policies, which could save you hundreds.
Doug & Associates, this is Mickey Marquis. Hello?
For expert help with all your insurance needs, visit geico.com/local today.
You coming to bed, hon?
Yep, honey, I'll be right there. Just gotta turn out the light. Ow! 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 Ah! Ah!
Some things never change. Like your kids always leaving tiny toys on the floor for you to step on. And Geico saving folks lots of money on their car insurance.
Sweetie, I think I left the downstairs light on.
Please don't make me go.
15 minutes could save you 15% or more.
Hi guys, and welcome back to What's Up Doc, the true crime documentary podcast. I am your host, Gemma Delaney, and I am here to tell you what is up with the latest offerings in the true crime documentary world. As always, guys, we are on social media. You can find us at What's Up Doc podcast. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. We're on TikTok as well. I don't post there too frequently. I'm trying to get into it. I'm easing myself into it. But look, we're back for another episode. We are full swing in season 3. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank you all so much for your support up until now. I'm absolutely blown away. All the listens, the plays, the downloads, the reviews. You will never know how much it means to me. I truly, truly appreciate each and every one of them. Back to the matter at hand. Today we are talking about Netflix's latest offering. It dropped on Thursday last, and I am talking about Memories of a Murder. This is the true crime documentary documenting the just unbelievable case of Dennis Nilsen. So for those of you who are not in the know, Dennis Nilsen was one of the most prolific serial killers we had over this side of the pond in recent memory. So Dennis Nilsen was a guy who he preyed on young, often homeless, often homosexual men. Not always, but that was his MO for the most part. It was that was the type of victim that he went for. Not always, but most of the time. And this documentary is obviously documenting that period of time. So we're talking about the early 80s in England, in London specifically, which was his haunt, which is where he found and killed his victims. The documentary was directed by none other than the same gentleman who actually edited not only Don't Fuck with Cats, but 3 Identical Strangers as well. So both incredible documentaries. Michael Hart is the director of this. And like I said, he's edited those 2 documentaries previously. So not so known in directing terms, but in terms of Netflix, yeah, this guy has done the work. It starts off very classically, I suppose. It starts off like most true crime documentaries do now, with the hook. It starts at the end. It starts with none other than Nilsen himself narrating his story, very much in the style of the Ted Bundy tapes. So you have him narrating the story as you go. What you'll notice about him is he's just by the voice, instantly watch it, see what you think. Straight away, I got Hannibal Lecter vibes off him. Very clipped, speaks with a very clipped accent. and very proper, very grand accent as well. So it starts off with, the image of that classic retro cassette recorder, and intermitted kind of shots of a typewriter, an old typewriter as well. So this is obviously to convey Dennis Nilsen transcribing his story when he was writing his autobiography. And that's predominantly what these tapes were made in aid of. It was him documenting the sordid story of his killing spree. Dennis Nilsen, look, instantly you get, like I said, Hannibal Lecter vibes off him. You get creepy vibes off him. This guy is not a nice guy. He comes across instantly as being a monster, a psychopath. And he says in the opening kind of minutes of the documentary, we've all got to die, somehow or someday. And just seems very flippant about life and indeed about death as well. So, it starts off with like all this imagery of like the classic cassette recorder, the typewriter of a jailhouse, looking through a cell window. And then you hear these reporters talking about, the biggest murder investigation in modern history in London. How he's the self-professed worst murderer of the century. So instantly you get a vibe of a guy who's looking for notoriety, right? This guy wants to be known. He wants a fucking autobiography written about him. He's not a shrinking violet. So it's London. It's 1983. It's a different world. That's the one thing I have to say about this documentary that sometimes I guess we forget, and it kind of shocked me when I saw this. Obviously, I know the story of Dennis Nilsen and his exploits, but I think, hearing about a story in modern times with a modern way of thinking and, modern opinions, I forgot how different a place London was in 1983. We're introduced then to the detective on the case, who is Steve McClusker, and he's talking about, the discovery of human remains. So if you're familiar with this case, this is not going to be any information to you. But I mean, if you didn't follow it religiously or haven't done any kind of deep dive into it, it's a very interesting documentary, and it brings you kind of step by step through how this guy was caught. So Steve McClusker, as I said, the detective in charge, he talks about how there's this place called Cranley Gardens and there's human remains discovered. How were they discovered, I hear you say? The fucking toilet was blocked. He was flushing them down the toilet. Yeah. So basically, toilets get blocked in this apartment block. An engineer is called out, has a rummage around the, pipes and the sewerage as you do, and he goes, holy Jesus, this is not shite, it's flesh and it's bone. And, in what limited kind of knowledge a sewerage engineer would have of anatomy, he's like, I think this is fucking human remains. So obviously the guards are called in. Not only is there human remains, but they're found in like huge quantities and massive amounts. And instantly, I suppose the suspicion goes to this resident of the top floor flat, Dennis Nilsen, known as Des. And he works in the local job center. So they wait for him to return to the flat. And again, it's the detective telling the story. They wait for him to return to the flat. He comes back. In the meantime, they realize that some of the flesh in the sewer, you can see strangulation marks on it. So not only is it, human remains, strangulation mark, it doesn't allude to a natural death. It's murder. Or at least suspicious, right? And they get into his flat, and instantly there's a smell of decomposing flesh. And like, you've heard this time and time again, if you're like me and you're glued to all these true crime documentaries, this is what they talk about. Once you've smelled a decomposing body, you can tell it from a mile away. It's undeniable. It's so distinctive. They smell it instantly. And they basically say, Des, cut the bullshit. where's the rest of the body? He opens up a wardrobe and there's black sacks in there. And then the detective talks about how like these black sacks are massive. And he turns around to him and he goes, how many is there? Like, that's more than one body. And Des rather flippantly kind of goes, 15 or 16, Now it shows crime scene photographs as well, which I love. I love that. It doesn't show any remains or anything like that, nothing too gory, but it does show, the flat in relation to, where the sewer is, in relation to where the wardrobe, but it shows the wardrobe with the black plastic bags. It doesn't show their contents, but I love that because it paints a picture. It helps you try and, place yourself at the scene and kind of walk it through. Really, I think to everyone's astonishment, he fucking confesses. Like, he doesn't kick up a stink. He seems kind of nearly proud of himself, I would say, and again, I'm saying this because we hear him narrating the story throughout with these tapes. So I'm not making any, great jumps here or leaps in my own mind. He sounds proud. He sounds, kind of like, aren't I a clever boy? Look what I managed to do and get away with for so long. But yeah, he confesses to everything and gives them great detail regarding each victim, what happened, how he, found them, how he came to pass with them, how he got them back to the flat, and they're obviously ultimately death, and then the disposing of their body. We're then introduced to a couple of journalists, Bence and Hamilton. And they kind of, the documentary comes back to them sporadically throughout the narrative as well, which is good. It's good to see the story from the journalist's point of views. And as well, the two of them are chalk and cheese. So one of them is like broadsheet journal and the other guy is tabloid journal. So the broadsheet guy is all about, oh my God, this case, and it's just insane. And the tabloid guy, which, again, you're either going to love him or hate him. I kind of loved him. I kind of loved his honesty. He was like, oh my God, like, it's horrible to say, but there's no words to describe the fucking high I got when this story broke. Like when we heard that, because initially they just, the story, I suppose, kind of petered out initially. And it was like, oh, a man kills another man and the body is found in the garden or whatever. Like, and then he said, when it kind of started coming out that like, he was shoved down a toilet, and then that there wasn't just the one victim, and that not only was there not just the one, there was 15 or 16. We're dealing with a serial killer. I kind of appreciated his honesty because, I mean, again, let's be honest, it might not be popular opinion, but that would be everybody's initial reaction. You'd be like, holy fuck, oh my God, I need to hear more. I know the second then would be like, oh my God, this is disgusting. And there's the moral aspect and all that. But I did appreciate actually his honesty in telling the story and how he was just like, oh my God, we were so excited and we couldn't get enough of the gory details. And because that is human nature. And if we're being completely honest, that is our initial instinct before then, obviously, the shame sets in and we're completely disgusted with ourselves. But anyway, I digress. But yeah, so these guys, the documentary makers come back to them periodically throughout the storytelling, and it's definitely to the benefit of the story, because both of them covered the case. But yeah, they're talking about how it quickly becomes this media circus, not only for the fact that obviously there's 15 or 16 victims, but as well, at least initially, it seems like they're all young homosexuals. This is London. It's 1983, and this is a big fucking deal. It's a big fucking deal to be a homosexual. Never mind be a serial killer that seems to target homosexuals. So it's a massive big deal. And again, just to put it in context, London 1983, being gay, like we're in Ireland, I'm in Ireland. Being gay was illegal up to 1987, the year I was born. You know what I mean? So it's not that long ago. I'm not that old, So it's just to put it in that context, it's a different world. And this was juicy. This was considered juicy, fodder for broadsheets and tabloids alike. And that's, I suppose, the second story in this documentary, which I have to say, I absolutely loved. And it is the story of how did 15 or 16 young men in London in 1983 go missing? And I suppose that's where the sad bit, the other sad bit is like the whole fucking story isn't sad, but you know, the sad aspect of this story, or the secondary sad aspect of this story, is the fact that like they didn't matter. And I don't say that lightly, but in this world of London in 1983, if you were a young homosexual man, if you were an old homosexual man, you didn't matter. You didn't matter. And that's basically what, you know, like I said, this is the secondary story running throughout the documentary. So yeah, 15 or 16 missing people in 4 years, this killing spree went on. Like, that's a huge amount of people to go missing and nobody to bat an eyelid, no missing persons reports, no fucking appeals on, you know, Crime Watch or Crime Line or whatever the British equivalent is. It's just really, really sad. The documentary then flips back, obviously, to the discovering of the bodies. So there's 3 bodies in total that are found at Cranley Gardens. So where are the other, you know, 11 or 12 that he was talking about? And again, Dennis, being Dennis, is more than forthcoming and tells them, oh, yeah, it's the place I used to live, Melrose Avenue. So they go to Melrose Avenue. And this is then when we're introduced to one of the police that was actively involved in the digging of the garden of Melrose Avenue, because that's where the rest of them were killed and that's where the rest of them were disposed. So Karen Hunt is the policewoman then that we're introduced to at this point in time, and she takes over a part of the narration. That's something I really like about this documentary. It really keeps you engaged at all times, because not one person is ever driving the narrative for too long. And sometimes that can seem disjointed, and sometimes that can be jarring and pull you out of the narrative. And it doesn't in this, because of the way it's edited together. You know, Michael Hart is an editor. You can tell he knows what he's doing. So there's lovely segues between each contributor, each narrator. So Karen Hunt is brought in here, this policewoman, and she's talking about how, you know, it's February when all of this is uncovered. So again, February over this side of the pond, it's fucking freeze. And they're digging these gardens in Melrose Avenue, and the ground is hard. And like, how do you even fucking do that? Like, just, you know, she's talking about very kind of mundane, basic, everyday things. But again, it puts you in the frame of mind. It puts you in the action. It makes you feel like you're there. And you can imagine how hard it would to be digging or trying to dig frozen ground in the depths of winter in February in London, in England. Dennis Nilsen's voice comes back in then, narrating it again, like I said, in this, you know, Hannibal Lecter style. And he's talking about how he disposed the bodies then at Melrose Avenue. And like I said, I kind of alluded to it already, in the garden. That's where they're digging them. That's not where he started, though. He starts by putting them under the floorboards. Like, honestly, it's just so classic serial killer, isn't it? Like, it's, you know, it's the boogeyman story you were told as a child, like, you'd be killed and put under the floorboards. He literally fucking did that. He put as many bodies under the floorboards as he could, and this is in his own words, until he couldn't take the smell and the maggots anymore. So you can imagine the squalor, this, you know, it's like something out of the fucking Texas Chainsaw Massacre, isn't it? It's just revolting, you know. When he runs out of space under the floorboards and can't deal with the smell or the maggots anymore, he then takes to burning his victims and spreading their ashes, their remains, out in the back garden, and kind of digs it through the earth to disperse it. He's talking about how he's targeting these young men who were on the street, who wouldn't be missed, and how he did this, or how he got them home, how he convinced them to come with him, was the offer of somewhere to sleep, a bit of booze, and probably, you know, a hot meal as well. They were starving, they were hungry, they were cold, they're on the streets. It's just, the next bit is kind of the mind this was a bit of a mindfuck for me. It really was, because I know the case of Dennis Nilsen, okay, but it's a couple of years since, it's a good few years, Jesus, since I read into it in any depth, and I kind of had forgotten details, I suppose. So at this point in the documentary, we're actually introduced to his mum, Mrs. Nilsen, and it shows, archive footage of her being interviewed by one of these journals, and she's like a sweet little old lady sat in front of her fireplace, like your nan had, my nan had, and a cup of tea in her hand, and like I said, sweet little old lady talking about, oh well, he was always nice, and he was a perfect quiet little son, and never did anything to draw attention to himself, and he was very close to his grandfather, and I was a single mother and I did the best I could. And then you have Nielsen's narrative, these tapes cutting back in, and saying she's full of shit, saying this is all lies. He's professing the exact opposite. In fact, he says that, she was ice, emotional ice, I think is what he calls her, that he was gay as a, obviously made this realization as a child. And, again, there's, in his narration, in these tapes, he's making a massive deal out of this. And I'm saying that he's making a massive deal, again, because it's 1983, so this is, in his mind, a huge part of why he's the way he is, why he's a fucking serial killer, because he was gay and, had to live in the darkness and in the shadows. He talks about living in the darkness and, couldn't really be himself, as if, gay equals serial killer. It's all kinds of wrong. But anyway, this is Dennis's interpretation of why he is the way he is. And then, they actually, I had forgotten this. I knew this and had forgotten this. They unveil that he was a former policeman in England. He's a former cop. So again, it becomes more clear. Not only did he target these young men on the street, but he actually used his own experience as a cop. He knew that these disappearances would never be investigated. He knew that there'd never be, missing person reports or any follow-up on them, at least, because they were disposable. This type of person, this young homosexual vagabond, homeless person. Homeless and homosexual equals disposable in 1983 in London. And Dennis knows this. He has seen it firsthand as a police officer. And they talk then as well to a former colleague of Dennis's. And this, like, I don't think that I ever knew this, actually. I think this was new information to me. But he talks about how there's this young man comes forward and says that he was attacked and this guy tried to kill him, and tells him the whole horrible story. And they go to the location and they go to the guy, and who was it? Only fucking Dennis. This is 5 years, I should say, before he's finally reprimanded for his crimes. So this could have been the first victim, effectively. They take a statement from the young man. He's underage, and his parents won't let him prosecute, won't let him take it any further, because the fear of the victim being outed as gay. So again, this is what you're dealing with in 1983. This guy was almost killed by Dennis, and his parents wouldn't let him prosecute because the bigger issue would be that he was gay. It's just fucking, it's insane. It's insane, again, to look at it with, 2021 eyes and think that was such an issue. But of course it was and is still in some parts of the world. So this is his targeted victim, these rent boys, as they're referred to throughout the documentary. Some of them are, some of them aren't, in the West End of London. And again, we're talking to Karen Hunt, this policewoman, and she, again, this is like what I meant about, you'd know it was an editor that was directing this documentary, because what she does is she's, doing a piece to camera, and she's talking about, she's kind of shaking her head and just going, it's so sad, and all these boys, and you just wonder how they ever ended up here. And then it cuts to a survivor of Dennis Nilsen, another survivor, Martin. So I like that. I like that transition. I like that style of storytelling, that narration where, somebody poses a question and then it's answered with the next contributor. I thought it was very clever editing. So Martin is a survivor. And again, a survivor 5 years before Dennis Nilsen's subsequent arrest. So these are like two, I think there's three in total come forward in the documentary, at least. I'm not sure in real life. I haven't looked into it, but three almost victims, almost could have been, in the mix with all those other corpses in the drain or under the floorboards or in the fucking garden. But for luck, what else? But Martin talks about his own story and how he woke up with Dennis Nilsen on top of him. And, he's kind of asleep, so he's not really sure what happened. But he got the vibe that, he was trying to kill him. He was trying to strangle him. He was trying to suffocate him. It's crazy. And he answers Karen's question, and he talks about what happened in his life that led him to this point. How did he get here? How did he become an almost victim of Dennis Nilsen? And he talks about how he, came from a small town, obviously very early on at a very young age, realized he was gay. He actually came out. He was brave enough to say it to people. And, it's just this really heartbreaking part in the documentary where he just talks about like being the local kind of joke, as a result of coming out. And then he talks about when he's 14, he runs away to London and works as a rent boy because he's freezing, he's starving, and he needs money. Simple as, needs must. What I noticed about the documentary as well, and again, I thought it was very clever at this point, we're kind of at the midway, a little bit more than halfway through at this point in time, and you'll notice a change in the narration. So the narration through the tapes with Dennis's voice still talks, but at the point in which the victims, or survivors, I should say, would-be victims are introduced into the narrative, his narration becomes lesser and lesser and lesser, whereas he is the main narrator in the first half. Once the survivors are introduced then into the storyline, his tapes, his little bits are less and less, more sporadically paced throughout the documentary, and it focuses more on the survivors' narration of the story and from their point of view what happened. And I thought that was really interesting, and within a very short space of time, these survivors and people who were family members of victims are introduced in the narrative, and they kind of take over from there on in. So next, like, we're introduced to Shane and Leslie. Leslie's partner was killed by Dennis, and then her son Shane obviously is talking about the death of his father at Dennis's hands as well. His name was Graham, and she talks about Graham being the love of her life, and how it broke her heart that the media focused on this story. And look, the media, we've talked about this in episodes before. They'll find a story, they'll find a gory story, and they'll stick to it. And obviously this was a gory story, but they definitely fixated on the homosexual element of it. And she said like how that broke her heart because her partner Graham wasn't. He was neither homeless nor homosexual. What he was an addict. And she talks about the last day that she saw him, that he got up that morning and he swore to her he wasn't going to have a fix. And she said just the way he said it, she knew he already had, like he was slurring his words. And then rather tragically, her last words to him were, to never come back again. And she says, and he didn't, I kicked him out and told him to never come back. And he never did. They were the last words I spoke to him. Dennis Nilsen finds him after having his fix and then some, he's stumbling along the road, trying to get a taxi. No taxi man will stop for him. Nilsen hails a taxi for him, hops in beside him and says, hey, come on, come back to mine. And then, it's this just really horrific story. And fair play to Graham's ex-partner, Leslie, for even, being brave enough to tell the story. She talks about how the media circus, again, that encompasses this story and this kind of a case. And she talks about the reporters at her door constantly, the barrage of questions, and she's giving them nothing. And a reporter, I guess, I don't know why, because he's a dickhead, but obviously as well trying to elicit some kind of a comment or reaction out of her, was like, do you know what happened to Graham? And she was like, you do? Because obviously, they're only going to tell her so much. It's an active investigation. And obviously this reporter has an insight into the local police station. He's got somebody feeding him the ins and outs of the case anyway. And he said, I know what happened to Graham. And she's like, tell me. And he tells her that Nilsen snuck up behind him, strangled him, kept him for 3 days. Guys, if you're squeamish, you might want to fast forward through this bit. Kept him for 3 days, sat him on the couch beside him. A corpse we're talking about now, the dead body of Graham. Sat on the couch beside him for 3 days. And then on the third night, he comes home, he stands Graham's body up, covers him in talcum powder, and then masturbates over him. Like I said, proper Ed Gein, Texas Chainsaw Massacre shit going on, like just absolutely beyond belief. Nilsen's voice on these tapes then interjects again, and I don't know, I guess tries to explain it. Can you explain it? Can you ever okay it? Tries to analyze why he did this, or why he wanted to do this, why that was sexually exciting for him. And he talks about, and we heard already that the mother, Nilsen's mother, talking about this bond he had with his grandfather. Nilsen talks about the sudden death of his grandfather when he was 5. The only person he ever really felt loved him, the only person he ever felt love from. And he talks about seeing his father's corpse in the coffin, white and stiff, a la the talcum powder. And he says that he believes that this is when, in his little child brain, love and death were mashed together and mixed, and, the boundary between them was blurred, that they were one and the same. Interestingly, his trial comes, and again, this is narrated by the victims' families and the survivors of Nilsen, and they talk about how after, tests, they decide that he is neither insane nor mentally ill. Which is interesting, because in these tapes, he definitely seems like somebody who is both insane and or mentally ill. A proper psychopath. But what's interesting is, at this point in the narrative, it changes. And you realize that Nilsen's a clever, clever man. And he is. And we knew that from the get-go. Like I said, he sounds very grand. He sounds very educated. And he knows what will make a good story. Now, can they prove this? No, but they are surmising. There seems to be no evidence that he had an abusive upbringing by a nice, cold mother. There's no evidence that he was sexually abused by his grandfather, and therefore, the seeing of his grandfather's corpse leads to sexual arousal, sexual attraction to dead men, and this is why he goes on a killing spree. One of the contributors puts it quite interestingly and says, he's trying to find someone else to be the monster by saying, I was raped and abused by my pedophile grandfather, and that's why I am the way I am. And they said, and it's lies. There's nothing to suggest he was. There's no evidence to suggest he ever was. He's just fucking evil. He's just fucking evil. And that's why he did it. There's no big, trauma he went through in his life that turned him evil. He was always fucking evil. And look, there's always going to be divide on that subject, nature versus nurture. Are people born psychopaths, or are they made? I don't know. I'm not an expert. But I just thought that was really interesting, that the general consensus among the experts is that this guy was just spinning a story. Like, this is all horseshit. He's completely sound of mind and body and just decided to do these awful, awful, atrocious crimes against these young men. And, that's it. That's it. He was an opportunist. There was nothing wrong with him. So it's an interesting documentary. I think as well, what I liked about it is, like I said, this sub narrative going on underneath the main one being obviously Nilsen, his victims, the survivors. And then there's this just a really horrific spotlight is shone on the attitudes of society towards homosexual men in 1983. And I thought that was fascinating. And I thought that was really cleverly done, because it just shows how they were worth nothing. They were worth nothing to anybody. They weren't even worth reporting missing. And this ex-policeman knew they were less than nothing. They were worth less than nothing. And that he would get away with it. And that's why he chose them. It kind of, the documentary wraps up at this point in time, and it talks about how of these victims, like, again, the numbers vary online. They say there's at least 12 victims. And, he himself said 15 or 16. But 8 victims were only ever ID'd from the remains that were found. And they were Graham Allen, Malcolm Barlow, Martin Duffy, Stephen Holmes, John Howlett, Kenneth, Stephen Sinclair, and William Sutherland as well. And it's just so tragic that, like, there's, probably that amount out there still that were never ID'd, and probably, are not going to be at this point in time. There's so many years have lapsed. It's just crazy. So, Memories of a Murderer. Do you know what? Like I said, this was only released on Thursday. In my opinion, this has been really, really, really harshly marked online. And I know there's probably hasn't been a massive amount of people reviewing it as of yet. On IMDb, it's 6.5. I just think that's ridiculous. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say I think this is one of the best true crime documentaries that Netflix has delivered in a long time. They've been putting out a lot of stuff, and it just hasn't been up to par, in my opinion. I thought this was phenomenal. I really did. It's not even an hour and a half long. It absolutely hooks you from beginning to end. There's just enough of the horrific, gory details that you won't, turn it fucking off, because it's unbearable to listen to. It's just enough to go, holy shit, this man was evil. The inclusion of the victims and their stories, I thought, was beautiful and so eloquent and respectfully done. So I think 6.5 is really fucking harsh. Like I said, maybe it is the fact that it's such a new documentary that there hasn't been a lot of votes yet, and it's just got 1 or 2 bad ones, and then obviously that's bringing the average down. It doesn't even have a percentage on Rotten Tomatoes yet, so like I said, it's just the fact it's not even a week old. But I thought it was absolutely phenomenal. I've watched it a couple of times now since it's been released, and each time there's something I like about it more. And I tell you what I love about it as well. Every single one of the contributors are brilliant. They're so good at pushing the story forward. In my mind, they answer every question that you have potentially about this case. I didn't find myself needing to Google anything afterwards, which is often the case with these documentaries. So I would absolutely recommend this. I thought it was brilliant. So Memories of a Murder, it's on Netflix now. Like I said, not even an hour and a half long. Stick it on there now after listening to this. You'll have it done before bedtime. So guys, that is another episode of What's Up Doc, the true crime documentary podcast, done and dusted. As always, if you like what I do, I'm a one-man band. You know that by now. Head on over to Apple Podcasts. Give me an 5-star rating and review. I'd really appreciate it. You can also, I never really flog this, but I also on my link tree, if you go onto my Instagram account, I've got a link tree, click onto it. You have the option of buying me a coffee as well. I am fueled on coffee, as are most true crime podcasters. Fueled by coffee. All of our research, we don't often have time to eat. It's all coffee fueled. So yeah, if you want to buy me coffee and further the cause, it will be much appreciated as well. But as always, guys, the time flies by. That is all we have time for this fortnight. Make sure to tune into our next Instagram live, which will be Wednesday next week. I don't know what date that is because I haven't got the calendar in front of me, but Wednesday next week. So tune in. That'll be on Instagram live. And if you don't already know that, every fortnight I release a podcast, and then the weeks in between we do an Instagram live with a guest, and we talk about the stories that started our fascination with true crime. So please do join and get involved, guys. As always, I've been your host, Gemma Delaney. Good luck, good night, God bless.
The only thing better than grinding all night for your side hustle is your roommate picking you up with Mickey D's breakfast. The perfect pickup deal.
There's a deal for every morning at McDonald's.
Right now, taste breakfast perfection when you get a warm and savory sausage McMuffin with egg for just $2.50. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with combo meal.
Noom Weight uses psychology to help people everywhere learn about their eating habits.
Eating is my love language?
Yep, sure is.
I say yes to seconds out of guilt.
It's hard to say no to Aunt Jenny's banana pudding.
Wait, I do what?
Oh, fog eating happens to everybody.
What the
We know. It can be a lot to take in, but with the help of Noom Weight, you'll learn the psychology behind your eating habits, how to change them, and get closer to reaching your weight loss goals. Sign up at Noom.com.